Welcome to the deep dive. So, you've shared a really fascinating stack of sources with us articles, research papers, all sorts of notes.
Yeah, all focusing on Bolivia, a country with, well, a very distinct story in South America.
Absolutely. And your material, it covers this huge sweep, right? Ancient civilizations, recent politics, the economy, culture, environment. It's all in there.
It really is a complex picture.
So, our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack all of this together. We'll go through the sources, try to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge.
And hopefully get you, the listener, really well informed on what makes Bolivia tick.
Exactly. Get ready. It's going to be quite a journey into a pretty unique place.
Definitely. Where should we start? The deep past seems logical.
Yeah, let's start right at the beginning, because the story, it goes way, way back. Your sources mention human presence, maybe 1200 BC.
Uh-huh. But they really zero in on the major pre-Columbian civilizations, particularly up in the Andes.
Right, these sophisticated societies rising and falling. Tiwanaku stands out, doesn't it? Flourishing, what, 500 to 1100 CE?
That's the one. And the sources really highlight their incredible building skills, Tiwanaku, with those huge, perfectly cut stone blocks, carved monoliths. Just amazing stuff.
And interestingly, the material suggests their expansion wasn't just like brute force military campaigns.
Exactly. It seems Tiwanaku's influence spread more through, well, colonization and trade networks. They grew high-altitude crops, potatoes, obviously, made textiles.
And traded them for essentials.
Right. Things like coke, saltpeter, metals. They had this wide reach, so as you could build power back then through economics and settlement, not just conquest.
But like all empires, they eventually declined. Internal issues, maybe external pressures. The sources touch on that.
Which then makes way for the Aymar Empire, the Collas. And they were different.
How so?
The sources paint them as more reliant on warfare to dominate the Altiplano, controlling a really vast area through military might.
Okay, so Tiwanaku, then the Aymara, which leads us to the Incas. They actually came onto this specific scene fairly late, didn't they? Late 1480s?
Yeah, relatively speaking. They basically moved in and took over the Aymara sphere. The sources talk about rapid expansion in the 15th century. Figures like Huáscar and Atahualpa pushing boundaries way out.
And they left a huge mark. Art, math, architecture, those incredible highway systems, planned towns, the terraced farming.
Absolutely impressive, no doubt. But, and this is key from the sources, their actual rule in this specific region, less than a century before the next big disruption.
And that disruption was, well, dramatic. The Spanish arrived 1532, and the timing couldn't have been better for them, really.
No, because the Inca Empire was already fractured. That civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa weakened them significantly.
So Pizarro's expedition, initially not that large, could just exploit that division.
And the drive for wealth was immediate. You know the famous story, the ransom for Atahualpa? Gathering all that gold.
But they killed him anyway.
They did. And the sources link that directly to the collapse of organized Inca resistance. It just accelerated their decline.
The Spanish weren't just after gold, though. It quickly became about land, resources, control. They set up key settlements fast. Potosi, of course.
Ah, yes, Potosi. El Cerro Rico, the mountain of wealth, became synonymous with silver, unbelievable riches flowing out.
And La Plata, which later became Sucre, an early administrative center built in that European colonial style.
And remember, this wasn't just military or economic. Religion was central. Evangelization was a core part of the colonial project.
Trying to bring everyone under control, including indigenous groups outside the main settlements, the sources use terms like Indios Bravos.
Yeah, a term reflecting that colonial viewpoint, often referring to groups in the eastern forests resisting control. Religious orders like the Jesuits were deeply involved, sometimes even backing military campaigns, like against the Chiriguanes.
What really jumps out from your sources, though, is how the colonial system seemed to deliberately deny the pre-Hispanic past. There's that really stark quote attributed to Bolivar.
Yeah, basically categorizing indigenous people in a way that denied them rights. It speaks volumes about the hierarchy they were building. Race, class.
The material shows the new republic's elite just wouldn't recognize indigenous authorities, even those chosen through traditional ways.
And the laws reflected that, severely limiting indigenous rights, especially land ownership, promoting abuses, undermining leaders, turning them into, well, almost political prisoners sometimes.
It sounds incredibly harsh. The sources talk about devastating population decline, over half the population in South Bolivia decimated.
Brutal. But even in that darkness, figures like Moreau emerge in the material. Indigenous folk heroes, symbols of resistance.
So the big takeaway from this era, according to the sources, the conquest and colonial period didn't just swap rulers, they embedded this deep systemic hierarchy. Exclusion based on race, culture.
Absolutely. It created these long-term fault lines, these challenges that Bolivia's been grappling with ever since,
A really difficult foundation for what came next.
which was the push for independence.
Right. Building on those colonial grievances, but the actual spark, interestingly, came from Europe. Napoleon invading Spain in 1808.
That destabilized things. Uprisings kicked off in Bolivia around 1809, La Paz, Sucre, and that inspired others.
But these early movements, the sources say, were mostly led by Creoles, the locally born Spanish elite.
That's right. They were mainly unhappy with the peninsulars, the ones born in Spain holding the real power.
And here's a fascinating point from your material. Indigenous and mestizo people often stayed out of it initially.
Yeah, apparently fearing that changing the rulers might actually cost them the little autonomy they had. It's complex.
So it wasn't until later, with the big uprisings like Tupac Katari's back in 1781 or that 1905 rebellion against forced land sales, that indigenous resistance really took center stage in challenging the whole system.
Exactly. The independence war itself was messy, deeply divided along class, ethnicity, region, almost like a civil war within a war.
Eventually, the Spanish side lost, and the Republic of Bolivia was born in 1825.
But the sources suggest the founders saw it mainly as just changing who was in charge at the top, an administrative shuffle.
Even though the first constitution, 1826, had all these modern-sounding ideas. Enlightenment, French Revolution influence, separation of powers, checks and balances.
Yeah, even state-funded public education was proposed. Very forward-thinking on paper.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There is. The sources hammer this home. The Constitution was implicitly for those the framers considered rational, which basically excluded indigenous people.
The term Indian itself was used in a way that suggested they couldn't govern themselves.
Precisely. It didn't recognize minority groups as having legitimate political identities or rights.
Hmm.
Civil rights were for the white elite. Social, economic rights, largely ignored for the majority.
So independence meant, as one source puts it, a profound continuity of colonialism.
Yeah.
Sovereignty just passed to a different elite group.
And that exclusion, that failure to build an inclusive state right from the start, is linked in the material to immediate and chronic political instability.
Constant fighting within the ruling class, numerous revolutions. The sources list 10 major ones, plus countless smaller coups.
And it wasn't just internal turmoil. Bolivia suffered huge territorial losses. The War of the Pacific against Chile,
Lost its coastline, 1879 to 84.
then the Acre War against Brazil, turn of the century,
1899-1903, more land lost.
and the Chaco War against Paraguay, 1932 to 35, another devastating loss.
Yet, what's striking in your material is that even after losing sea access, Bolivia has never given up the claim. For 150 years, they've pushed for sovereign access, even in international courts.
Those losses became what the sources call a critical juncture, deeply shaping policy, national identity. This idea of territory and sovereignty became incredibly potent in their politics.
Economically, this whole period was rough, too. Cycles of mining booms and busts silver, then tin.
And the sources note that later, when U.S. interests bought up major mines, it often meant rock-bottom wages, like 30 to 100 cents a day for unskilled work.
While living costs were high, it points to this ongoing struggle over who actually benefits from extracting Bolivia's wealth.
Definitely. And out of this turmoil, you see labor movements starting to organize. Places like Machaca in the late 70s, workers demanding rights.
Your sources mention brief moments, like under a socialist president, where wages rose, unions got stronger.
But then swift reversals. Back to authoritarian military rule, severe repression, torture, disappearances, killings. It's a brutal cycle described in the material.
So bringing this back to you, the listener, why does this history matter? The sources strongly suggest these cycles of instability, loss, and economic hardship aren't random.
No, they reflect those deep, unresolved colonial divisions, the failure to create a truly inclusive nation. It left Bolivia with, as one source says, a thin economic base to sustain more than a fragile democracy.
Leading to these dangerous and vicious lurches between extremes.
A past that casts a very long shadow.
Which take us into the 20th century, described in your sources as just a dramatic era. Internal splits, civil wars, those external defeats.
Plus the mining sector collapsing, growing debt. It all created fertile ground for revolutionary change.
And the 1952 National Revolution really stands out as a key moment.
Absolutely. It involved miners, peasants, indigenous groups, using votes but also arms to gain civil rights and challenge the old oligarchy.
The goals were radical, right? Nationalizing the big mines, major land reform.
Huge aims. But the sources also cautioned that the immediate aftermath was chaotic. State authority was weak, especially outside the cities. The political system was pretty basic in rural areas.
Though party organization did start to develop, sometimes building on existing structures like trade unions, incorporating indigenous traditions into leadership, but it was a difficult transition.
And then came another shift, the 1964 military coup ending the M&R government's run. That ushered in long periods of authoritarianism.
And those structural adjustment policies, often pushed by international bodies.
Right. Even when democratic transitions were attempted later, like in the late 70s, the sources argue they fell short of establishing a more just society.
Economic power stayed concentrated. Political power often ended up back with the military or the old elites.
By the late 70s, discontent was simmering again. The state was losing legitimacy. Protest movements were active, but the material suggests they sometimes lacked clear, long-term alternatives.
Which sets the scene for something new. The rise of what your sources call anti-systemic parties around the turn of the millennium.
Yes, parties like the Movement Towards Socialism, the MAS-IPSP, they grew directly out of social movements, challenging the whole traditional political setup.
And they use this language of authenticity. Leaders emphasizing they were ordinary citizens, not part of the old guard.
Exactly, contrasting themselves sharply with the established political class.
And this momentum built up to that historic election in 2006, Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president.
Your sources frame this as a real culmination. Decades of social struggle, anti-neoliberal sentiment, anti-colonial discourse, finally breaking through that historical exclusion of the indigenous majority.
His government brought big changes, nationalizing key industries, oil, gas, mining. And crucially, that new constitution in 2009.
Establishing Bolivia as a plurinational state. That's a hugely significant concept.
The constitution itself, the sources describe it almost as transformative constitutionalism, recognizing all the different languages, cultures, legal systems.
And formally enshrining collective rights for indigenous nations, self-determination, control over territory, things like that.
But the sources also provide a more complicated picture of this era, don't they?
They do. Despite real gains in recognition and participation, those policies focused on resource extraction. The extractivista model became really controversial.
Because of social and environmental impacts.
Yes, and also concerns about wealth distribution still being unequal, about new forms of elite capture even within the new structures.
The material mentions ongoing divisions among social movements, both indigenous and non-indigenous, and even accusations of a kind of neo-colonial dynamic emerging, with violence sometimes linked to state or corporate interests in resource areas.
It highlights this core tension, which the sources really grapple with. How do you embrace being a plurinational state, recognizing indigenous rights, while your economy still heavily relies on extracting resources, often from those very indigenous territories?
It's a fundamental challenge for contemporary Bolivia.
And one deeply rooted in all that history we've discussed.
Okay, let's maybe zoom out for a moment. Look at the country itself, the land, the people, because the geography is just stunning.
It really is. Landlocked, yes, but incredibly diverse. You've got the Andes Mountains soaring up, the high altiplano plains.
Averaging, what, 12,000 feet? With Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake.
Incredible. And then you drop down to the eastern lowlands, the Amazon basin, parts of the Gran Chaco swamp.
The sources also mention its unique water system, rivers flowing inland or towards the Amazon and Paraguay, none reaching the sea directly from Bolivia.
A consequence of losing the coastline, reinforcing its landlocked reality.
And this diverse land holds an equally diverse population. Over 60% identify as indigenous, the sources say, dozens of recognized nations.
Which is exactly why the plurinational state idea emerged. It's an attempt to reflect that demographic reality in the country's very structure, recognizing collective rights, autonomy.
Culturally, it sounds incredibly rich. Pre-Hispanic traditions aren't museum pieces, they're alive?
Absolutely. The sources talk about festivals, practices that keep ancient cosmologies and myths relevant today, a living heritage that contributes to national identity.
And linguistically complex, too. 26 official languages recognized.
Yeah, quite a mosaic. Though there was a history of pushing for Spanish dominance, current policy tries to promote indigenous languages. But they still face challenges. The prestige of Spanish, lack of use in technology.
The material also touches on arts, music, Influences from indigenous roots, Spanish, Jesuit missions, even unique old musical scores found in archives.
A real blend of traditions.
But alongside this richness, there are serious challenges. Environmentally, the sources mentioned Lake Pupo's problems and, crucially, climate change impacts in the Andes.
That's a big one. Glaciers retreating fast, threatening water supplies for cities and agriculture. Rainfall patterns changing unpredictably.
And the temperature projections are stark. 2 to 3 degrees Celsius hotter by mid-century, maybe 4 to 6 degrees by the end.
The sources say this will have important and far-reaching ramifications for farming, biodiversity, health, especially for indigenous communities whose traditional ways of life are so closely tied to those specific Andean ecosystems.
Economically, too, despite changes, the label poorest country in South America still appears in the material, alongside high inequality.
Yeah, there have been improvements, some poverty reduction programs, but deep gaps remain in wealth, land ownership, education, access to services.
And the sources consistently link this back to that historical legacy of exclusion. How hard it is to make economic growth, often from resources, translate into truly equitable improvements for everyone.
Trade is part of that picture too. From early ties with Europe to more recent major partners like the US and UK, often focused on exporting minerals like tin.
The sources raise questions about needing better infrastructure for trade and the risks of relying on finite resources like tin, especially if global demand shifts.
So looking ahead, the picture your sources paint is one of continued struggle, continued transition. Evo Morales' time was significant, a Pachacuti, as some sources call it, a world-turning moment.
But it also came with questions. How to solidify democratic gains, how to manage resource wealth versus persistent poverty, how to navigate those deep tensions between development and indigenous rights, environmental protection.
Exactly. The sources conclude there are still these unresolved deep problems tied to that long historical fight over control of the state and its resources. Political stability feels fragile, easily swayed by economic ups and downs, and those deep ideological divides persist.
So we've taken quite a deep dive, guided by your sources, into Bolivia's complex layers.
And what really stands out, I think, is the sheer resilience, especially of the indigenous cultures, persisting and adapting through centuries of pressure and exclusion.
We've seen this arc: powerful pre-Columbian societies, a harsh colonial system, a turbulent independence, an unstable republic losing territory and struggling economically.
Leading up to these recent efforts to forge a more inclusive, plurinational state driven by social movements demanding change.
The sources show a country really wrestling with its past, that colonial legacy, the inequality, the political fault lines.
While at the same time trying to embrace its incredible diversity and face up to modern challenges like climate change and the need for sustainable development that actually benefits everyone.
Which leaves us with a final thought, really a question for you, the listener, to ponder based on everything we've unpacked from these sources. Given these persistent struggles for inclusion, for equitable development, for stable governance, what do you think is the single most significant challenge Bolivia faces today in truly making the ideals of its plurinational constitution a reality?